Hi, I'm Karen Guglielmo with SearchCIO.com, and I'm here today with Troy Dumoulin, Director of Product Strategy for Pink Elephant. We're here today to talk about IT service costing models. So Troy, can you first tell me, how would you define service-based costing?
Well, actually, Karen, service-based costing can be best understood in relationship to what are we putting in front of a customer for a line item in either a budget or a cost item. If you consider what most organizations do today is what we call component-based costing. They'll identify a server, an application, a desktop, and they'll try to find a likely home for that to focus or to attach to a business unit so that they bear the cost of that component. And so the concept of component-based costing is I look at all my technology and pieces in my environment, I say who gets to pay for these individual things. The problem with that is that a given component is never a service in itself. Right? A server is never a service. An application in isolation with all the other things is not a service either. So when we go to service-based costing, we think about, okay, we have a service called accounts payable or check processing or power generation, which is focusing on a business outcome. Or we have an IT back office service like hosting or storage. These are capabilities, right, which are built by many components. Now, the challenge with component-based costing is that assumes that every single component can be tagged to in a given business unit. But that gets very complex when we get into shared data centers, especially when the new virtualization technology now, any given component can be serving multiple business units at any given time. So how do you sustain a component-based costing model when there's no reality to relating a technology piece to a business unit for recovery? So that forces us to get into the concept of service-based costing, because the first thing that will happen when you define your services is your customer will ask, okay, great, that's a service, but how am I charged for it? So you now have to start thinking about consumption of service capability. How am I getting charged for accounts payable versus how am I paying for a server? Now what you do, and we're going to talk about that in a session coming up, is we are going to take all of the components, all the direct cost for that service, all of the indirect costs from other services needed to deliver it, like network, like storage, etc., like security, like architecture. We're going to have an allocation of those indirect into the direct cost of a messaging service. And then we're going to charge back that messaging service as a unit, like a mailbox. Right? So how many units do you need of messaging? That'll be based on how many people you have in your organization. Now we are burdening that unit, the messaging mailbox, with all of the costs related to the service, not just the direct. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. Makes perfect sense. And in your presentation, you discuss, or you will be discussing, better methods for measuring IT costs based on service rather than technology components. What are IT leaders using today for measurement methods that aren't as good as, we should be improving on?
Well, we're a product of where we've come from, Karen. We are really, in the past 20 years of IT management, technology-focused organizations. We organize our technology structures by domain or platform or towers of excellence, or many different words we use to describe. Really what we're talking about is collections of like technologies. So I have a tower or a domain for my servers versus my databases versus my mainframe, and I try to do this by technology component. Then we get into this issue of how do we tag these components directly to business units when they're actually shared. So where we have come from is a technology focus. Where we're moving is to a service focus. So the technology-focused component-based model we use today doesn't stand up underneath this service consumption model. And as mentioned in the earlier question, it just falls apart when we get into all these shared virtualization models.
Okay. And how would you say a CMDB approach can help service-based cost?
It's a great question. Now, I can probably articulate the definition of service management in a very straightforward statement. It's an easy statement to say, but more difficult to achieve. You could define service management as IT having an accountability for understanding how does any technology component enable or disable a business process outcome. And then when I understand that and I can model that a component relates to a system, that system supports a service, that service supports an a business process outcome, then I can understand what I'm doing here is in the CMDB is modeling the complete architecture of business service down the technology component. What that allows me to do in the final statement from a costing perspective is to say, okay, I get it. All these components directly relate to this service. These components over here relate to another service. Some components are shared across both, and they'll be shared. And so the CMDB models for me the direct and indirect costs that are actually comprising the service.
Okay. And actually, I have one final question for you today, Troy. Talking about cost and talk about funding, I just went to a presentation with Ed Peterson from Chevron, and he talked a little bit about ways of getting funding within the organization for ITIL.
Yes.
Could you say, in your experience, where are CIOs getting funding within the organization, and how do they go about that?
Another interesting question that changes over time, Karen. Initially, in my experience, most organizations, when they initially adopt these projects or programs for service management improvement, they get the funding out of the initial projects out of their existing operational budgets. Now, that might seem interesting because why would we fund a project finding monies from somewhere? Wouldn't we want to put that in front of a portfolio project process which prioritizes our projects and gives us the funding we need? Yes, that is true, but the counter side of that is when we talk about building a service desk or doing incident management or change management, and then we go to the customer and we say, can we have some money for the thing that you think we're already doing and that you're already paying for? It's a very difficult argument. So what normally is done, in my experience, is the first projects will be funded out of operational budget.
Okay.
But then they can show demonstrated benefit, and the customer satisfaction has gone up, the customer experience has improved. So then they can have a different conversation with their client. They go, Mr. Business Unit or Mr. Client, you know those customer satisfaction improvements we've made, well, that's related to this initiative we have called service management. Now we're going to the second phase. We need some capital funding for some significant procurement, like project or tools in relationship to automating. Now I can get to the point of requesting a formal project and formal funding for that project. The last point I'd like to make is that while we call these ITIL processes because that's what they are, in essence they're also professional services. In the sense, just as security management or IT architecture is a professional service.
Yes.
So when you have a service which has value, right, like security, like change, like availability management, but it also has cost because it has real people and real resources associated to it, I have to understand how will not only I implement it, but how will I fund it going forward.
Okay.
Every process that ITIL talks about is actually also a professional service. So just in the same way security management is funded, typically by indirectly allocating a charge of security across various services which are consumed by the customer, you also have to indirectly charge these other professional services we understand as service management processes.
That makes perfect sense. Well, thank you very much, Troy, for speaking with me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Thank you, Karen.